Schultz and the Hitmen Destroyed the Philippines by Mike Billington in 2004. Editor's note: this is the third in a series of features on the assault against the Third World by the economic hitmen. We examine here first the case of the Philippines, and then Mexico. The U.S. orchestrated coup which overthrew the government of Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos in 1986 was a classic case study of what John Perkin described in his recent book, Confession of an Economic Hitman, as the post-World War II preferred method of imposing colonial control under another name. In the Philippines case, George Shultz performed the roles of both the economic hitman, destroying and taking full control of the Philippines economy, and the coup master, deposing the Philippine president in favor of an imp puppet while calling the operation People Power. Throughout this process, from the late 1972 through the February 1986 coup and beyond, Lyndon LaRouche and his collaborators were fully engaged in the fight to expose and reverse this subversion and destruction of one of America's most important allies. By the supranational financial institutions which Schultz and his ilk represent, by mobilizing support from patriots of both the United States and the Philippines. The LaRouche effort put a spotlight on the crimes of Schultz cabal, as will be shown below. Although the effort failed to stop the process at that time, the crimes thus exposed in the Philippines can and must serve today as a nemesis to Schultz and his neoconservative operatives, who are in an endgame in their effort to impose a new fascist order over planet. In a November 16 interview on radio station DCAR in Manila, LaRouche described his own view of the special mission of the Philippines nation. The Philippines has a very important pivotal role, some people would say geopolitically, in the entire region, of trying to bring together on a global scale for the first time, the world system, which is capable of accommodating both the European cultural heritage and Asian cultures. This is the great barrier, the great frontier, of a hopeful future for this planet, to bring together the cultures of Asia which are different than those of Western Europe generally with European culture, to get a global culture based on a system of sovereign nation states, which understand that this unresolved cultural question has to be addressed with a long-term view of several generations, of creating an integrated set of sovereign nation country, with a unique importance for the people of Asia, in particular. In playing a key role in bringing about this kind of general integration of Asian and European civilization. The lesson of the subversion of the Philippines in the 1980s for today is clear. Schultz is the eminence grease behind the neoconservatives running the Bush administration, which has brought the world to the current disastrous circumstance. It is also the case that the Philippines, although currently lacking any national leadership comparable to that of Marcos, is nonetheless facing a new coup threat, orchestrated by the same neoconservative circles in Washington who were responsible for the 1986 coup. The popular memory of Ferdinand Marcos today, in the US and in the Philippines, is largely shaped by the massive disinformation campaign created in the early 1980s by the circles around then Secretary of State Schultz and his deputy Paul Wolfowitz. Marcos was accused of corruption, human rights violations, plunder, and even the murder of a political opponent, Benigno Aquino, and this caricature is repeated ad nauseam still today. While Marcos was not without faults, he was by far the last Filipino head of state to have understood the challenge of true leadership in a world slipping towards chaos. His overthrow by the Schultz cabal had nothing to do with the charge issued publicly, but were intended to stop his national development policies and his international collaboration with LaRouche and others in countering the genocidal policies of the IMF and bringing into being a new world economic system based on development and justice. Marcos' true legacy. Marcos was elected president in 1965 just as the United States launched the disastrous and futile war in Indochina War, fed a domestic insurgency by the Maoist New People's Army. NPA. Marcos was then treated as a close friend and ally of the United States, even when he declared martial law in 1970 with the Indochina War still raging. The administration of President Richard Nixon raised no objections, but Marcos was not only concerned about counterinsurgency in declaring martial law. When he was elected president in 1965, the Philippines was still essentially a colonial economy, although the United States had granted full independence on July 4, 1946, as had been promised by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1930, for productivity was low in both agriculture and industry. Agriculture lagged as the Philippines relied on special access to U.S. food export, and industry was confined to process industries rather than the development of basic industries. Marcos set out immediately to establish Philippines' food self-sufficiency in rice and corn. This also required breaking the control of the landed aristocracy left over from the Spanish imperial era. Marcos was the first president of the Philippines who did not rise from this elite class, but was a commoner trained as a lawyer. As president, he focused on basic agricultural infrastructure, especially irrigation, in the major food-producing regions of Luzon and Mindanao, credit facilities, mechanization, and the introduction of high-yield rice varieties, which needed irrigation, resulted in the elimination of rice imports by 1968. Land reform, primarily a political problem, remained elusive. However, when Marcos imposed martial law in 1972, among his first acts was a proclamation that the entire nation was to be considered a land reform area, and declaration that all tenants working land devoted primarily to rice and corn were to be the owners of the land, up to a specified limit. Despite the enraged opposition of the oligarchy, the program proved to be extraordinarily successful. Coupled with the infrastructure and mechanization improvements, 250,000 peasants became landowners, and grain productivity increased by half. Another major step after the declaration of martial law was to contract with Westinghouse for the Bataan nuclear power plant, which was to be the first and would still be the only commercial nuclear power plant in Southeast Asia. While nuclear power is clearly the only sane solution to the energy requirements across the region, the sad saga of the Bataan nuclear plant symbolizes the pure evil of the policies enforced by the economic hitmen. As originally contracted, the plant should have cost about $1 billion and produced 1.2 megawatt of electricity by 1984. However, after the hysteria generated by the anti-nuclear Club of Wall Street (CIR) DEC 3, 2004, following the 1979 accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, the Carter administration imposed retroactive safety regulations which contributed to more than doubling the cost of construction. Then, after the overthrow of Marcos in 1986, one of the first acts of the new presidency of Corazon Aquino was to mothball the fully completed, but never used, Bataan nuclear plant. The Philippines has been forced to pay countless billions in debt service, and pays still today over $155.0 per day for this nuclear facility, without having drawn 1 watt of electricity from the state-of-the-art facility. To further nuclear power facilities which were planned to provide 1,880 megawatts of electricity by 1991 were also scrapped. Nuclear energy was not the only innovation of the Marcos regime. In 1979, Marcos announced a plan for 11 major industrial projects, with the intention of shifting the focus of the nation's industrial economy from consumer goods to basic heavy industry. Included in the plan were steel, petrochemical, pulp and paper, a copper smelter, aluminum, phosphate fertilizer, diesel, engine, gas and oil, a coconut industry, and the nuclear power program. The Marcos administration, during the 1970 to 81 martial law period, tripled the country's road network, doubled the electrification of the country's homes, increased irrigated cropland 8-fold, and achieved rice and corn self-sufficiency. Minimum daily wage rates tripled, although inflation driven by international oil price hikes and exploding U.S. interest rate more than wiped out these wage increase. Thanks for watching the Masagi TV. Please subscribe and click the notification bell for updated on my next video.